Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. Today, the government and the internet. There have been several pieces of legislation and more promised impacting life online. And we're going to take a look today at why. What are they up to? What are they really trying to achieve here with all these interventions? So where do we go? We go to Dr. Michael Geist, law professor at the University of Ottawa, where he holds the research chair in internet and e-commerce law, and he's also a member of the Center for Law, Technology, and Society. And he does his own podcast called Law Bites, which often deals with the same material. Welcome, Michael. Good to see you.
Oh, nice to see you too. Thanks for having me.
We thought before the end of the year, we better wrap this stuff all in a little package and put a bow on it. Good luck. That's all I can say if we try and do it. I know you were testifying, as were many others, in front of the CRTC way back to Bill C-11. We'll get to that in a moment. But one of the other folks that testified said, look, what we're seeing in the mainstream media, the newspapers, is, not so much a market failure, but a market correction. Like, that world is changing. They didn't get ready for the internet in the right way. They thought they did, but they didn't. And subsidies don't really work if people don't like the product or how that product is being delivered. And that there are other things we can do to try and incentivize people and maybe rescue a little bit this industry. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So that puts us into the news side. So that was
Yeah,
not the CRTC. That was
yeah,
that's obviously been Bill C-18 or the Online News
yeah.
Act. And as you know, the government has managed to get a deal with Google, although I think they've significantly overstated the benefits that are going to come out of that. In fact, I think there are many that actually end up losing some of the largest
Yeah,
mainstream
we're going to get
players.
into that in a minute.
You
Yeah,
know, in terms of the overall approach, I think there were better approaches that could have been taken. I do find myself as someone who does believe that there is a public good in access to news, and can appreciate that the current model, it leaves many struggling. Now, the issue often will be is the solution that's being proposed causing more harm than good, and I think that that's what we did have with Bill C-18, that there were better approaches the government could have taken that would have had less harm to things like independence of the press, that frankly would have hopefully allowed for better support, quite frankly, for journalism than where the government has ultimately landed. So I
this
think
is
there
the
were better
problem.
options and they didn't take them.
Like, when government decides it's going to directly fund media, you've got a problem. Like, if you're in the journalism business, you've got to say, this makes it difficult for me not to be objective, although that may be an issue too, but to be seen to be objective. If you're on the
Yeah,
payroll, it's a problem.
I think it is. And, I think we now have a structure in Canada where, based not even on Bill C-18, but based on the labor journalism tax credit, we've got newspapers that are looking at 35% of their labor costs, and some digital publishers as well, 35% of their labor costs covered. They were initially hoping for another 30
Yeah.
to 35% to be covered by the two tech companies. That's not going to happen, but they are still going to get some of that covered. And over at the CRTC, we've got some of the broadcasters asking for money there to come from the Netflixes and Amazons and Disneys of the world. And I do think that it's hard to make a credible case that all of this has no impact at all, that you simply carry on as before. I think for individual journalists, I'd be suspect that it has that effect. I think individual journalists are doing their job without a whole lot of regard for where their paychecks are coming from. But the blurring of editorial and
Yeah.
business, the impact it has on those businesses, and I should note on the CBC, which I think has found itself as a cheerleader for some of this legislation as a beneficiary, and I don't think that's been an appropriate role to take
No,
either. I think
without even
creates significant
declaring
problems.
interest when they tell you the story. I mean, usually if on the air you hear a story about Bell Media, the CTV anchor is obliged to say, that's the owner of our company, right? Just to declare those interests, and the CBC. Yeah, I'll wrap this up on that particular point. But what we're seeing in the online world is people subscribing to services that they like, just like we used to do in the old days, where you subscribe to a newspaper. Um, And if the government really wanted to incentivize journalism, you could just say you're going to get a tax credit for your subscriptions to these online or, offline, like print, um, publications, or at least give them the same kind of status that we have for political donations. We actually fund political parties and let that be a tax write-off. At least we could do the same for this.
Yeah, there is a digital subscription tax credit, but it's very modest and
Very
does
small.
hasn't been seen to really
Yeah,
move the needle much at all. But I agree with you. One of the potential approaches would be to say, listen, out of there's this big pot of money that we're now trying to make
right.
available, whether by tax credits or otherwise, and allowing people to make their choices. In terms of really making it close to free from a sort of a tax perspective for people to subscribe, and having that as the way that you'd help inject some funding, I think was one of the options that was available. And again, they didn't take that as well. I think, and there's obviously been a lot of criticism of the CBC. I do think that the sad irony with the approach that the CBC's taken here is that it had a role. I think it has a role to play in a world where most news is available primarily through paywalls. I think there is something to be said for ensuring that all Canadians have access to news without a paywall, but it would require the CBC to envision itself as being something different from the commercial broadcasters and stop competing directly with them either for ad dollars or competing with them, seeing them as direct competitors even for Google money. And
Yeah.
that hasn't been their approach. They've kind of tried to dip their hands into all of these different pots, and I think that's been a real mistake, because I think that if anything, this provided an opportunity for the CBC to make the case that there was value there
In
worth
what they
paying.
provide. Yeah.
And if they end up basically saying we are no different than any of the commercial alternatives, well, then why should the public be funding it?
Well, the other thing is, I mean, they already get 1.4 billion. Like, to ask for more seems a bit much, like clean up your house. But with these other approaches, it would actually reflect what the consumers are interested in, which is, I think, we've kind of lost sight of in all of this stuff. So anyway, let's go to Bill C-18, because finally at the 11th hour, Google said, okay, we'll give you $100 million. Go away. Stop bugging us. We just want to get on with life. They were prepared to do that a year ago. And the government, for its part, has said, major victory. We forced them to the wall and extracted this money. Looks like Google gave them a bit of a face saving out.
They did, but I think that if you drill down a little bit and take a look at what they actually got, there isn't a ton of face saving here other than the worst case scenario, which of course was blocked news links on
Yeah,
search results, which would have been disastrous, I think, for everyone. And so that's been avoided. And as you know, Google had made it clear, really from the outset, that there was an openness to paying, that they already paid as part of deals with many companies,
we're
and
already
so
doing it. Yeah.
they were. So then the question became, what was this going to look like, and sort of how much was involved. I do think that at the end of the day, the impact for many news outlets will be quite negative coming out of this. So, if you take a look at the Google money, yes, it's 100 million. Let's take away a certain percentage, maybe 10%, let's say, for administrative costs that will no
Yeah.
doubt be layered into whatever entity becomes the leader to sort of negotiate on behalf of this fund. So already we're talking probably
Yeah.
closer to 90 million, let's say. Let's then take off what Google already had in deals, because they will be wrapped into this. And some have
Yeah.
speculated
Let's
that it
just
was
stop there,
tens of
Michael,
millions
because
of dollars.
I think
Sorry.
that's really important. I mean, we heard testimony from all the big media players saying we already had a deal with Google. The numbers were often secret.
Yes.
The newspapers didn't want to say how much. We don't actually even know whether the 100 million is more or less than what they were already paying out.
Yeah, I think most believe that it is more, but how much more is the
Yeah,
question. And when you talk to people in the industry, certainly some will speculate. We are talking about tens of millions of dollars that was already there. So we're not talking about, in terms of new money coming in. There's something there to be sure. It's nowhere near 100 million in new money, and it's nowhere near 100 million in terms of what ultimately goes to the industry. And then you have to think about how all that gets allocated. And given the approach that The parliamentary budget officer estimates that 75% go to broadcasters, perhaps as much as a third of it goes to the CBC. So what's left in that scenario for print is small. We're talking about maybe a
Yeah.
quarter or a third of it. So 25, $30 million basically split amongst all of these players. It's very clear, and it's perhaps even less once you deduct administrative costs, very clear that that's nowhere, that is not equal even to what they were getting before, and now it's being split amongst a whole range of players. It is possible, and we, as we record this, we still don't have the final regulations.
Right.
It's possible because, and certainly we've seen hints of it, that the government will step in and decree a little bit how some of the allocation ought to take place, essentially create some sort of
But
caps on
then
some of these
again, we
things.
have this problem. What is government doing in that side of the business? That,
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's exact. You're exactly right. And that is exactly the problem here. The government had set out from day one that, they were not going to get involved in any of this. They were simply
right,
setting the table, we were told, to allow for the negotiations. Well, ultimately, they did the negotiating on behalf of the industry, came up with a number. We know some in the industry don't even like the number. It's been
right,
clear. Torstar, for example, has come out against the deal. And then, because of the way this has been structured, because, for example, let's say on the CBC, they had an out in the legislation back when it was initially proposed,
exactly.
where it said that public broadcasters would be subject to potential additional regulation. So they even early on recognized there was an issue here. Once it went through committee, they just blew that out of the water and
Yeah.
basically said, no, no
So,
limits on the CBC. Now
and
they
they're
are
gonna pick
left.
winners and losers. Like
Yeah,
this is the last thing you want them having their mitts on.
I think that's right. And now we find themselves quite possibly actually stepping in and saying, okay, we are going to create a cap for the CBC. We're going to create a cap for broadcasters because what's left here isn't nearly enough. It doesn't even make the print players whole from what they were getting before. So that's just the Google side of the equation, and we
Yeah.
haven't even included the losses all of these entities are sustaining from not just no money coming out of Meta out of this, but lost deals from Meta and all the lost news links that quite clearly had significant value. So
But they just walked
I
away, just for those that, Meta just said, it's such a small part of our business. We don't want to get into bed with government. We'll see you. Take a hike. Facebook's not going to carry this stuff.
That's right. And so when you add all of these things together, I think it becomes very hard to see a scenario whereby how this is described as a win. You actually have many entities with less, you have far less than what the government had promised initially, and you have all the harms that have come from this, whether it's the blocked news links or the questions about the independence of Canadian media. All of those are still issues that are still very much at play. So, it's hard to see this as anything other than, I think, a really poorly thought out piece of legislation that many warned about, and
Yeah.
yet the government moved ahead, and now it is at the stage of trying to save the furniture a little bit to salvage whatever it can.
Well, and it seems like the prime minister gave an interview a couple of weeks back with one of the smaller players. I think it was Village Media, I'm not sure, but it was almost as if he didn't understand this. He said big streaming services like Google have been making massive amounts of money off the backs of Canadian broadcasters and newspapers. Just not true. I mean,
No,
it's
it's
not how it
not.
works.
It's not. And you had this, this dynamic that for a year and a half with this legislation where the companies were pretty consistent about saying, what their response would be to the legislation and the way that it was structured. And, it's as if the government simply refused to believe it, that
Yeah,
they thought this was a bluff. They did not take seriously the claims that the companies were making, that news just was not a major profit center. And while there was, in Google's case, a willingness to provide support for that sector, it was not an unlimited amount. And in
right.
Facebook's or Meta's case, that this was content that in many ways is just not good content if you're a social media company at all. It drives people off the site. And we can, get into lots of questions about the concerns with respect to Meta.
Yeah.
But in this instance, they were pretty clear cut, and the
Yep.
government
No,
just seemed
absolutely.
to not believe it. And I think, to be fair, so too the Canadian media companies that were the lead lobby for this. There were more lobbyist meetings with News Media Canada than there were with any tech company.
No, I know,
It's
which is outrageous. Yeah.
it's pretty clear they didn't believe it either, that they
Yeah.
thought that these companies couldn't live without Canadian news, and then found themselves really stuck in a difficult position when it turned out that they made a very wrong bet.
Well, this is the whole thing. Like everybody seems to have lost sight. Google and Meta are not Canadian companies. These are global entities. And that takes us back to the whole fight about C11 and whether or not you can tell streaming services that they've got to favor Canadian content or French speaking content, and they've got to promote it, and they've got to do all of this. Like, they actually don't have to do any of that.
Well, listen, if you operate in the jurisdiction, it's open to Canada, as it is to
Yeah,
any country, to establish some rules. And I think that, those companies face those rules in a lot of places. And I don't have
yeah,
an issue with the Canadian government saying that there are going to be certain rules if you want to participate in the market, as you might do to any other company. Where I have some concerns is with the government thinking that companies from all sectors don't respond to legislation and regulation in a way that at the end of the day is going to be a profit maximization strategy. Now,
right.
say you don't like it, but that's simply
They're in
reality.
business.
We rely on that in many instances, right? We rely on, let's say, environmental legislation to not just encourage, but try to ensure that companies act in an environmentally friendly way. We want them to respond to this legislation. And we know that if the costs of compliance are viewed as overly onerous or out of step with what takes place elsewhere, that some of those companies may say, listen, I just don't want to operate in your jurisdiction if
Yeah,
that's the case. If we've seen it with respect to the funding for EV, some of the EV battery plants, where said
yeah,
we're giving some to one company, and so another company, Stellantis, says, "Well, listen, maybe I'm not going to be able to invest now
yeah,
unless you come up with something else." I mean, there's reactions like this all the time. We've seen it in telecom as well, where companies respond to CRTC decisions and say this is going to have an impact on our investment. I don't know why anybody would be surprised that tech companies would take a look at the cost of doing business, whether it's coming out of C11 with some of the demands that we're seeing for cross industry subsidies there, or out of C18, and
yeah,
not expect the companies to conduct an assessment of it. Now, if you want to ensure that they pay their fair share, well, that's what the tax system's all about. And I'm
exactly.
all in on that. But once you start coming in with these more boutique cross subsidy models, you are going to increase the costs. And so, some companies will eat it. Some companies will pass along those costs to consumers. So the
Yeah.
Canadians ultimately pay more. And some may say that for certain of their service lines or their service altogether, they're simply not going to provide it in Canada because the economics don't make sense anymore. And, I don't think that's a tactic. I don't think that's
No,
evil.
this is
I
the,
just think it's a reality of how things function in
they
all
have a
sectors.
fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders to make money, not to help governments implement policies.
Yes, and government has a responsibility to establish the policies that it thinks it's appropriate. But
Yeah,
where you do so, you at least have to be live to the consequences on all sides. And in this instance, the government seemed to ignore those consequences. And ultimately, they said, I think rightly, they were asked several times. The minister at the time, Rodriguez, was asked. He said, "Well, it's a business choice." Yeah, it was a business choice. They just didn't think that business choice might actually include blocking news links or walking
right.
away.
But it did. This, when you were testifying in the last few days, this is the other thing about legislation, which maybe the outside world doesn't understand, is that we governments propose legislation and it gets studied and it comes to the Senate and it gets passed or it doesn't get passed and all the rest. The devil is always in the details, because then what happens is they go and decide what the regulations are, and you can almost undo a piece of legislation or at least substantially change it through the kind of regulations that you put forward. So that's kind of what you were reacting to, I think. What were you seeing there?
Well, so I mean, certainly your listeners may recall the long legislative battle that took place over Bill C11, the online
Yeah,
streaming bill. That's of
most of
course
my
now
adult life, as far as I can remember.
it's taken up way too much of my time as well for the last couple of years. So, once that passed, the government punted on a lot of the details, right? In some ways, much of this legislation was a bit skeletal, and it was left to the regulator, the CRTC, to determine many of the specifics. And they've started that. And we're talking about what will be a very lengthy series of hearings. They've said as many as 9 different proceedings. Not all of them will be in person. They've already had at least a couple that were not, that were just paper based with submissions. This was the first in person one. And it involved the basic question of, at a minimum, an interim mandated payment by streaming services. Basically, what would be the threshold to bring in these services? And should they be subject to some sort of minimum mandated payment, even just on an interim basis, just for as a basic payment, as the CRTC sorts out the remaining issues.
So
And so this,
this is different than under Bill C-18. We're going to make the streaming services pay and pay into a fund. This is now a whole new set of things they want them to pay for.
well, this, yeah, so this is, these are largely different streamers, although of course
Yeah,
Google and Meta have potentially some involvement here.
yeah,
But yes, this goes back to the C11, which, a lot of the focus, of course, you'll recall, was around user content. But uh, there was always this issue of taking large streaming services, bringing them into the Canadian system, treating them as the equivalent of broadcasters or
yeah.
broadcast distributors, cable and satellite companies, and saying, just like those companies, you've got to pay into the system.
Like
Now,
YouTube. We'll use the YouTube example because we've got a whole generation of people that are in Canada making their living on YouTube. And there was a whole question about how big is big? Like at what point do you end up getting treated like the CBC when you're just a YouTube, content provider?
right, right. So there were those questions. This is
Yeah,
focused more on the services, not
right.
on the individuals. That's really where the emphasis is, though. It's not on individuals. It's on whether or not the services, whether or not Netflix or potentially YouTube, Amazon, Disney, whether they are required. So there are at least a couple questions that have to be answered there. One is, what is the threshold? How big do you have to be in the Canadian market before you get captured by this? And then second, if you are captured by this, should there be some sort of interim payment? So noting that there's a whole series of issues that the CRTC has been tasked with addressing, some of which will be familiar questions around the discoverability issue, how prominent do you make Canadian content, algorithmic related issues, what is even the meaning of Canadian content, how much content, Canadian content on your system. So a lot of questions that are out there. CRTC is going to have to deal with those. Many of those will be, I assume, next year. But we've got many in the industry that are saying, well, we don't want to wait that long. Basically want cash now, and we'll sort out some of the other issues later. And so what you had over the course of 3 weeks was just this lineup of entities all showing up, everything from film producers to Bell, all saying, hey, times are tough. We want payments from these companies. You had the companies by and large saying, we recognize that there may be some costs here, but they oftentimes were talking about high thresholds so that only the largest were captured. And they said, listen, we think that, and for the most part, all of these issues ought to be sorted first. And even if they're not, if you're going to establish some sort of payment, it needs to be consistent with some of the global standards that we see, which many countries don't have it at all. And if they do, it's a couple of percent at most. So that's kind of the battle. When I appeared, and I appeared towards the end, my position was essentially, listen, the consumer and competition seems to have been almost completely forgotten from
Yeah,
all of this.
exactly.
Um, and at the end of the day, much like C18, you need to be factoring in what are the potential or even likely consequences of the system that you're putting into place. And, if it means less competition, if it means services that exit the market or decide not to enter into the market, or consumers having to pay more, those I think ought to be factored in as
And
well.
not servicing the consumer, not letting them make the choices about what
Well,
they want.
yes, you wouldn't be able to make the choices if the service isn't even available in
Exactly.
Canada, of course. So that was my view was that 3 weeks of hearings and very little in the way of a consumer public interest perspective. I thought it was my first time appearing as a witness before the CRTC. I've done lots of Senate and House appearances, but never the
Yeah, yeah.
CRTC. It was certainly an interesting experience. I not surprisingly, I got a fair amount of pushback. But one of the real takeaways for me was candidly just how foreign the idea of a consumer focused approach was. You had some of the commissioners really kind of, viewing their role as sort of an industry regulator acting on behalf. We were told in one instance of, the ultimate goal of the Broadcasting Act, it said, was to benefit creators and artists. And I'm like, well, what about the view? Where are the viewers here?
Yeah,
I'm not
where are
saying,
the
I'm not
viewers
saying
here?
that there can be multiple beneficiaries here, but if you
Yeah.
aren't even identifying the viewer, the broader public as the goal here, without them, there is no broadcast system.
Mm.
Then there's a real problem. And so
Well, it's like
I walked away concerned, quite frankly,
yeah,
about some of the perspectives we were seeing.
Well, this is what we've always said about the CRTC. I mean, they regulate and they rule and they insist upon and demand Canadian content, but they don't demand Canadian content that people necessarily want to watch. Like you do have to try and balance those things. Otherwise, it's all for naught.
Oh, no question. I think the viewer, I mean, the public as a whole has to be factored into this in a far more significant way.
Right.
We need to it should ought, and I made the point, you ought to recognize that there's quite a lot of services out there that are servicing, expat communities or,
Right.
different kinds of communities that are that this is the way that they touch base with
Right.
family who may be in another country, and it's content that isn't often otherwise available. They want to have that sort of access. If we create frameworks with low enough thresholds that some of those services who operate on a true global model suddenly say, operating in Canada has just become too expensive from a
Yeah.
regulatory perspective, the costs and these kind of submissions and other things that we need to contribute, then suddenly you may find yourself without some of those services. And I think
Yeah.
that obviously would be a mistake. I think the government has pointed to choice and affordability as important considerations as well. So my goal in appearing was really try to urge the CRTC to
Yeah.
ensure that they kept that in mind, because
And
they sure
stay
weren't
focused.
hearing about it from many of their witnesses.
The other issue kind of along this line is the digital services tax, which has sort of been on and off and finally I mean, the Americans, I think, quietly done that, but we heard the American ambassador go public and say, if you do this, we don't like this. You can't tax our companies, American-based companies, and there will be retaliatory measures if you do this. So where are we on this? Does the government not care, or was it bargaining, or
Yeah,
where?
that's a good question. And I have to say, I don't think we completely know where we are. We know that the government will move ahead with one if there is no international, if an international deal that was developed
Yeah,
through an organization known as the OECD does not take
right.
effect. So the government's made that clear. And they are moving ahead with legislation that will ensure that that can take place. The question as to when this will take effect remains a bit of an open question. The government had said it would take effect as of January the
And one,
1st.
yeah,
It now seems fairly clear that that won't be the case. It will take place at some time afterward. I must say, generally speaking, I think the digital services tax is the right approach. I think that, if you want to, if you make the case that these companies aren't paying their fair share, this is the way to do it. I
yeah,
do think that we are better off, in part because if you take a look at the international deal, Canada is a significant net beneficiary in that deal. The deal basically says that that we find a bit more, find a number of ways for sharing the tax benefits that accrue from these different companies. Canada has a few companies for whom they might lose some tax revenue that they currently get the lion's
yeah,
share of the tax revenue. Those companies would begin to pay some in other jurisdictions, a DST elsewhere. But we have far more companies that are not paying into Canada under the current system that would within that agreement than we have ones that we'd lose some of their revenue. So we are a net beneficiary from all of this. It seems to me we ought to be strongly behind that and
yeah.
recognize that pushing ahead without that deal carries, again, this is a theme that we've had, carries with it some potential consequences.
Yeah.
And the
I
US
mean,
has
if the
said that,
Americans decide they're going to retaliate, they're going to retaliate. I mean,
yes.
that's what why we have free trade agreements. You play that by the rules, and when you don't, there are punishments either
And
way.
there's and the risk there, in some ways there are a lot of parallels, because
Yeah.
I think we've seen the government by and large dismiss those risks, think, the US really wouldn't go ahead and do that. And we saw I think just yesterday, as we record this, the prime minister saying he's never heard significant opposition from President Biden. But we know there are many in Congress that have voiced some significant opposition. And I guess the question becomes, in an election year in the United States, do you really want to take the risk of retaliation that can target whatever sector that they want? So,
And which is
a
politically
commensurate,
popular.
oh, well, of course. So you would target, if you're running for office, why wouldn't you target the dairy sector, a sensitive
Yeah.
area in Canada, but may help with some votes in Wisconsin, or the steel sector because it might help in Pennsylvania? Of course you would. And so there are real risks here, and the government, seemed once again to downplay some of those risks, and I think that too makes a mistake. All of in a context of saying, I don't think there's anything wrong with the DST. In fact, I think it's the right approach. But I think that the best approach with the DST is one where we've got an
Yeah.
international consensus and follow through on that.
And you're not standing alone. Before we wrap this up, I want to come back because you and I've been talking about this for a long time as well. The online harms bill. This goes back to when Guilbeault was the minister. He said some pretty provocative things at the time that, the government wanted to have a little bit more say over what they thought was, creating harm online and what they agreed with. And, I think the other ministers that have followed have been a little bit more careful on that issue. But it's really come into play now, since October 7th, and what we are seeing in terms of the reportage on what goes on, what's going on in the Middle East, how people are described, what they are called. You have been very vocal about this. You are Jewish. You have a view. You have been strong. I happen to share your view on this. I'm astounded that we have university presidents talking about, whether calling for the genocide of Jews is really a matter that's up to interpretation. But is this whole debate that's now unfolding, and again, the lack of government action? I mean, we have hate laws in this country already. They could be responding to the people standing on the streets doing this, and they're not. Um, but has it changed the dynamic around this whole discussion around online harms and legislation on that front?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Well, first, we know that in terms of the government's approach to this, you're right, it's been delayed for a long time. We are now led to believe that the responsibility for that file has changed. They've moved it
Yeah,
from heritage, which frankly never made any sense for online harms, over to justice. I always thought that justice or public safety was the right place for
yeah,
that
because there'd be a
bill.
thousand legal issues around
It's,
this.
it,
Yeah,
it, I mean, this is fundamentally a safety issue, and you could see that playing out over the last couple of months. And so the idea that this would be framed as a cultural sovereignty issue is frankly bizarre. It just never made a lot of sense. So I
yeah,
think that shift is a good thing, but it's clearly taking a lot of time. Listen, these are hard issues, and certainly the last couple of months have been both very hard, but also illustrative of the need to ensure that at a minimum the large platforms live up to what they say their policies are, and they're held accountable for when they fail to do so, and that law enforcement itself takes action where there
yeah.
is where there is unlawful activity. We've seen a bit of that, but definitely not enough of it. And then, of course, we've also seen what takes place on university campuses, where I have to say that I talk to many students for whom receiving death threats has now become almost commonplace. If you are as any part of a Jewish organization right now on campus and have any sort of visibility, there are real world security risks here. We're not playing toy soldiers. We're talking about real
Right,
stuff.
right.
And um, the failure at times within some of our institutions to take action here, to not take anti-Semitism seriously enough, which was, of course, I think encapsulated by that appearance at the U.S. Congress by 3 university presidents. But I think we have issues here in Canada as
Yeah, we
well
do.
on some of these
Absolutely.
issues. Um, it has been a real concern, and I think the government too often was too slow in responding to this. It was spoken more generalities around hate or about the need for balance and the like. And of course, we ought to be speaking out strongly against all forms of hate. But
Mhm.
these are real issues right now to the Jewish community, and the fact that we haven't seen, I think, enough people from all communities stand up against that is deeply troubling. It's frankly things that would have been unimaginable before
Well, I
October
was
7th.
saying
I'm
that
still struggling with it.
to a young, friend last night in a discussion about this, which is, and I guess partly it's just an age growing up with parents who were the World War II generation. The notion that you would talk about killing Jews the way that Hamas and Canadians, frankly, are talking about standing on streets with placards. It's unbelievable to me that we're allowing that. But the division is now. So we hear government ministers talk about doing this, the moral equivalence of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, when we were really dealing with the latter, and not responding to the kind of violence we're seeing on the streets and the uttering of hateful language, which is against the law, versus somehow trying to manage this online. This problem isn't just online. This problem is in the real world.
It is absolutely, and I think, there's certainly thoughts that online fuels this, and we do see a lot of misinformation take place
Yeah,
online, a lot of propaganda take place online. Frankly, a ton of hate online. I've been the
yeah,
target of stuff
absolutely.
that is frankly astonishing. When I sometimes read my mentions, and the at times the failure to deal with that by both from a legal perspective, but then also from a platform perspective, I think is deeply troubling and has helped fuel much of what we see take place. And so, this has certainly provided, I think, a very strong case for why there is a need both to apply the laws of we as they exist right now, but also taking a harder look at what is missing. Are there things that are not in the law right now that could be
Yeah.
there that would enhance the effectiveness of what takes place? Is there enough responsibility being laid at the feet of the platforms? And I think there's a strong case that there isn't. That doesn't mean I want platforms monitoring every single thing that takes place on their platform, but I sure want them to live up to the policies that they've established and be held responsible where they fail to do so. And that I don't think is inconsistent with freedom of expression. I think it is wholly consistent with freedom of expression and with appropriate responsibility and legal responsibility. And if we don't have laws that have put that into place, then in some ways, what are we waiting for? And
Yeah, well,
these are
that's
yeah, and these are hard issues, but the long delays here to at least come up with something, not to lay all the blame at the feet of the platforms, but to ensure that we've got a system that can do a better job of addressing some of these harms is long overdue.
Well, that's kind of where I'm coming from, which is we need to set the tone because if governments don't act on this, or if governments won't speak the words or show up at rallies or whatever it is and support causes they believe in, then it just fuels that other stuff online because every action has a reaction there too. Yes, it's provocative and sometimes it initiates, but it also reacts to what governments do and don't do. So again, it's that like in the real world, behave the way, lead by example,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right.
And that's what we're not seeing. I mean, you've got, the case of Elon Musk. Everybody loves to hate Elon Musk, right? But then he's accused of being anti-Semitic. Then he takes Media Matters to court, saying, they misrepresent. They're not sharing his views. It all just has this sense of censorship about it, right? Who is going to decide in the end what's fair, what's right, what's hate, what isn't hate? These are really tough questions.
They are, but we have courts and laws that deal with some of those questions, and so there is, to me, at times it's less a question in terms of some of the line drawing, and on
Yeah.
some of the stuff there is an opportunity for enforcement. I think in some ways Musk, I think, has been disastrous for
Yeah.
Twitter,
Or Twitter.
or X, or whatever he wants to call it right now. I think the reality is that place has become very difficult for people to engage in the kind of conversations that
Yeah.
used to take place there. There is a lot of hate. There are a lot of violations. And the fact that they have kind of absent themselves from that has really rendered the
Under the
service
guise
almost
of free
unusable at this
speech,
stage.
right? Like, I mean, because that's the other thing, much bigger.
Yeah, but he just put Alex Jones back on this
Yeah.
platform. This is not this is about fostering, in many instances, hate speech, and that we should not countenance at all.
So what do you think will be? I mean, is the government waiting for this to cool down? Is it an issue they don't want to try and deal with as they may or may not be heading into an election? Or
Yeah,
like, are they,
it's hard to know exactly what they're thinking. I guess that, obviously the change in department may have
yeah,
resulted in a bit
may
of a,
signal something.
it has delayed this. At a minimum, I don't have a crystal ball to figure out when this
No,
is coming, but I will say that unless it comes early in 2024, 'cause clearly not coming this year, unless it comes
yeah,
in early in 2024, the window to get this legislation through, I think
yeah,
will largely have closed.
yeah. No, I think that's right. And AI, I don't know, these debates go on about the doom and gloomers, it's the end of the world as we know it, or it's our savior. Uh, I suppose we could, is there something they need to be doing around that to kind of respond online? It's very hard to manage what algorithms do. I mean, yes, they can target them, but when is such and such a word hateful and when is it history or, used in context? Is it gonna help us deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see the AI stuff as much as, around the hate issue, although there's obviously a
Yeah,
component there as well. But there are, I think, a lot of AI regulatory issues that we need to be thinking about. Sometimes, some of them I don't think necessarily require immediate action. The government's consulting right now on copyright and generative AI,
yeah,
and I think it's a good thing to get those perspectives on the table. There are cases that are before courts right now. I'm not convinced that we need legislative intervention right now. We're literally just about a year into
yeah,
ChatGPT becoming popular. I think we're better off seeing how some of these things play out. But on other issues, we can identify some of the harms, or at least begin to establish some of the legislative guardrails around AI. And on that front, we do have government legislation designed to deal with some of that with C-27, but it's been a source of frustration, I think, for
yeah,
many as well. Partially because it's delayed long overdue privacy legislation, because now you've got both of things happening.
yeah,
It's made the hearings very difficult to follow. The government has been moving the goalposts a little bit fairly
sure,
regularly as well by changing
yeah,
what it says it wants to do. So I think there is a need to deal with AI. I'm not convinced that the approach they're taking with AIDA and C-27 is the right way to do it. Um, and I wish that they would have adopted a bit more of a consultative approach, separated out the privacy and the AI bills, so that at a minimum we might have privacy legislation that would be put on a bit of a faster legislative track.
yeah, I agree with that 100%. Okay, I'm clearly losing my voice, so I'm gonna wrap it up. Thank you so much for, you're so helpful all throughout our year as we try and walk our way through these bits of legislation. I sit in the committees, we study it, but it's really important that the Canadian public, understands what goes on up here, and you're really making a huge contribution. So thank you very much. All the best in the new year. We'll be talking, I know, in 2024 about all these same issues, won't we?
It sounds good. I'm sure they're not going anywhere. Oh,
No, they're
thank,
not.
okay. Thank you.
Michael Geist,
Okay. Thank you
professor
for having
of
me.
law at the University of Ottawa, holds the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce. Just a really valuable, well, he participates in all these hearings, writes about it a lot, does his own podcast, and it really helps us all think through it. So that's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. We'll see all of you soon as well. Thanks, Michael. Bye.
Thanks. Bye bye.